1550. The Hapsburgs were now the richest entity in human history. Every year, the treasure fleets arrived, dumping a mountain of silver and gold into the port of Seville. To the world, Spain was an unstoppable juggernaut, but look closer at the ledger. While the gold was flowing in, the prices of bread, wool, and life were skyrocketing. Spain had the most money, yet they were becoming the poorest nation in Europe. They had upgraded their assets, but they had failed to upgrade their system. This is the story of the first global resource curse, a forensic audit of how the greatest treasure in history became the greatest financial disaster. Today, we track the gold flush that led to the world's first imperial bankruptcy. This is episode 4, the Spanish default. By 1550, the House of Hapsburg had achieved the ultimate dream of any medieval state, an infinite supply of precious metals. From the silver mountain of Potosi to the gold of the Incas, the wealth of an entire hemisphere was being liquidated and shipped to a single port in Seville. To the contemporary observer, Spain was the undisputed CEO of the world. But beneath the surface of this glittering empire, a fatal systemic flaw was beginning to emerge. This is the story of the first resource curse. It is a forensic audit of how a surplus of money, without a corresponding increase in production, can actually destabilize the very nation it was meant to enrich. While the world looked at the gold with envy, the ledger was already beginning to scream for a reset. The Spanish had found the metal, but they had forgotten that money is not wealth. It is merely the fuel for it. The problem was the price revolution. As the Spanish treasure fleets arrived, the volume of silver in circulation skyrocketed, but the supply of essential goods, bread, wool, and tools, remained fixed. This was a massive inflationary shock. The Spanish people found that while they had more silver in their pockets, they could buy less than ever before. Because Spain failed to invest its silver into industrial infrastructure, the money simply chased a limited supply of goods. Prices doubled, then quadrupled. This systemic failure made Spain the most expensive place in Europe to live, effectively pricing Spanish craftsmen out of the market. Instead of an industrial upgrade, the gold flush created a nation of consumers who were rich in currency, but poor in the ability to produce the very things that currency was meant to purchase. Spain became a transit point for wealth. Because domestic production was too expensive due to inflation, the silver immediately flowed out of the country to buy cheaper, better-made products from the Dutch, the English, and the French. The Spanish Empire was essentially subsidizing the industrial growth of its future rivals. This was the birth of consumer dependency. Spain held the silver, but Northern Europe held the human capital and the manufacturing base. For every bar of silver that arrived in Seville, a corresponding amount was exported to build the warehouses and navies of Amsterdam and London. The silver was a ghost, haunting the halls of Madrid, but living in the counting houses of the north. Spain was winning the lottery, but Northern Europe was building the business. Have you wondered how an empire with mountains of silver could go broke? Here we have King Philip II of Spain. He saw the massive silver shipments from the New World not as a chance to build his country, but as a blank check for global domination. He poured this treasure into funding a permanent state of war, creating the most expensive military machine the world had ever seen, fighting battles from the Mediterranean all the way to the Netherlands. But here's the catch: war doesn't make money, it just burns through it. Philip started borrowing against silver that hadn't even been mined yet, just to pay for today's battles. This is a classic case of imperial overstretch. The Spanish crown was trapped in a vicious cycle. Every shipload of silver that arrived was already spent, just to pay off the debts from the last war. Philip was the most powerful man on earth, yet also the world's most desperate debtor. His vast empire wasn't a powerhouse of wealth. It was basically a giant credit card for his military ambitions. As the costs of war outpaced the arrival of the fleets, Philip II turned to the bankers of Genoa and the thuggers of Augsburg. He began issuing Asientos, short-term, high-interest loans backed by the promise of next year's silver. This was the birth of predatory sovereign lending. The bankers knew Spain was in a liquidity trap, so they raised the rates to compensate for the risk. Spain had the most valuable collateral in the world, a mountain of silver, but they didn't have the cash to pay their soldiers today. The Genoese bankers became the shadow directors of the Spanish state, dictating fiscal policy to ensure their interest payments remained the priority. The crown was gold, but the ownership of the empire's cash flow was held in the private ledgers of foreign creditors. The breaking point came in 1557. Despite the endless flow of silver, Philip II could no longer meet the interest payments to his Genoese and German creditors. He issued the Decree of Bankruptcy. This wasn't a failure of resources. It was a failure of cash flow. The world's richest man had officially defaulted. He forcibly converted his short-term high-interest Asientos into long-term low-interest bonds called euros. This was the first of many defaults. Spain would go bankrupt for more times in the next 50 years. Each time, the king used his sovereign power to unilaterally change the rules of the ledger, proving that in a crisis, the law of the state overrides the contract of the bank. The Spanish default had a profound effect on the emerging world. It created a society that devalued work and overvalued status. Because inflation made manufacturing unprofitable, the Spanish elite focused on land and titles, assets that couldn't be easily inflated away. This was a de-skilling of the nation. While Northern Europe was upgrading its human capital through science and industry, Spain was looking backward to a feudal ideal. The gold flush had acted as an anti-innovation drug. Why invent a better loom when you can just buy one with silver? The Hapsburgs fell into the rent-seekers trap, where easy wealth prevented the necessity of progress. They were rich in bullion, but poor in the software of the future, the industrial and financial innovation that was beginning to thrive in the north. Who, actually, owned the Spanish Empire, not the Hapsburgs. The debt was held by a network of international financiers who realized that a bankrupt king was the perfect client. By 1575, the debt was so large that the entire annual silver shipment from the Americas wasn't enough to even pay the interest. The wealth of the New World was being extracted twice, once from the earth of the Americas, and again from the treasury of Spain. The king was merely the middleman. This was the moment the world learned that hard assets mean nothing without a functioning financial operating system. Spain had the gold, but they lacked the human capital to manage it. The ledger was clear. Spain was a failing firm with a high-value asset, and the vultures of the north were ready to pick the bones. To keep the system alive, Spain had to increase production at any cost. They introduced the meter system and the mercury amalgamation process. A massive technological upgrade to silver mining. Potosi became the first industrial city of the Americas. But this wasn't an upgrade for the people. It was an upgrade for the creditors. The more silver Spain produced, the more the value of silver fell. They were trapped in a commodity death spiral. The increased supply lowered the price, which meant they had to produce even more just to stay in the same place. It was a treadmill of extraction that benefited only the people at the end of the supply chain. The merchants of Amsterdam and the bankers of Genoa. Spain was working harder and harder for a diminishing return. As Spain struggled with its internal defaults, its subsidiaries began to revolt. The Netherlands, the most industrially advanced part of the Hapsburg Empire, saw the Spanish financial collapse as their moment to exit. They didn't just want religious freedom, they wanted to stop their taxes from being used to service Hapsburg debts. This was the start of the Dutch pivot. While Spain was locked into a model of extractive wealth, the Dutch were building a model of publicly traded capital. They were about to take the systemic upgrade to its final form. They realized that a nation's strength isn't found in a mountain of gold, but in a market of shares. The gold was about to find a new home. And this time, it wouldn't be owned by a king. It would be owned by a corporation. The euros became the first widely traded government bonds. but they were also a sign of systemic desperation. By 1598, Philip II was dead, leaving a debt of 100 million ducats, roughly 10 times the annual revenue of the state. The Spanish Empire was the first, too big to fail, entity in history. The bankers couldn't let it collapse entirely because they were too exposed, but they wouldn't let it grow because it was too risky. Spain was a zombie empire, kept alive by high-interest life support. The golden loop had become a sovereign debt trap. This is the forensic reality of the 16th century, a world where the most powerful empire on earth was actually a debt-servicing machine for a private financial network that had no loyalty to any flag. The alternative to this extractive model was emerging in the north, in England and the Netherlands. Freedom of movement and specialized labor were becoming the new drivers of wealth. In Spain, the opposite was happening. The rigid feudal structure, reinforced by the Inquisition, prevented the emergence of a professional class. If you weren't a noble or a priest, you were nothing. The silver didn't create a middle class. It destroyed it. By the time the silver began to run out, Spain had no industry to fall back on. They had traded their human capital for metal capital, and they were about to find out that metal cannot be eaten, and it cannot innovate. The systemic upgrade was passing them by, leaving a nation of ghosts in its wake. The audit of Potosi is a story of extraction at scale. It was the largest industrial complex in the world, employing 40,000 people in a high-altitude wasteland. This was industrialization without modernization. The Spanish built the infrastructure to move the metal, but they didn't build the infrastructure to move the people. It was a closed system designed solely for export. This is the hallmark of the resource curse, the focus on a single asset to the exclusion of all others. By 1600, Potosi was the third largest city in the world, but it was a city with no future. Once the silver was gone, the city would vanish. It was a fever dream of wealth that left only scars on the land and zeros on the ledger. Who profited? The Genoese. For a century, the age of the Genoese ran the world. They were the shadow hegemon, controlling the credit of the Hapsburgs without ever needing a crown. They understood that the rails of finance are more valuable than the cargo of gold. They moved the Spanish silver into the global market, using it to fund the burgeoning industries of Northern Europe. They were the systems integrators of the 16th century, turning the Spanish Empire into a giant ATM for their own global investments. Spain was the muscle, Genoa was the brain, and the brain was already looking for a new body to inhabit, one that was more efficient and less prone to expensive wars. The systemic upgrade that Spain missed was the institutional upgrade. They failed to create a stock market, a central bank, or a stable legal framework for private enterprise. Everything was tied to the person of the king. When the king failed, the system failed. This single point of failure is what made the Spanish Empire so fragile. Contrast this with the decentralized models emerging in the north. The Dutch were about to show that trust in the system is more powerful than loyalty to the king. The Spanish default wasn't just a bankruptcy of money. It was a bankruptcy of an entire wave of organizing human society. The era of the monarch was ending. The era of the shareholder was beginning. By 1620, the gold and silver were no longer enough to even pretend Spain was solvent. The inflation had finally caught up with the reality of a dead industry. Spain was the first nation to experience deindustrialization before it had even fully industrialized. They had been hollowed out by their own treasure. This is the forensic reality of the gold flush. It wasn't a gift, it was a debt that could never be repaid. The golden loop had completed its circle, and it was tightening around the neck of the Spanish state. The money trail was now a river of red ink, and it was leading directly to the docks of Amsterdam, where a new kind of power was being built, brick by brick, share by share. We see the echoes of the Spanish default today in every petrostate and every resource-dependent economy. The lesson remains: money that isn't tied to human capital and production is a poison. The Spanish had the world at their feet, but they lacked the software to run it. They were the victims of their own venture capital moonshot. As we move forward in our journey, we see that the systemic upgrade isn't about finding more gold. It's about finding better ways to manage the gold you have. The trail is moving north. The era of the king is over. The era of the corporation is here. While Spain was defaulting, the Dutch were refinancing civilization. They were creating the first public debt system, where the citizens own the debt of the state. This created a shared interest in the success of the nation. It was the ultimate systemic upgrade. No longer was the debt a burden of the king. It was an asset of the people. This financial democracy is what allowed a tiny nation like the Netherlands to outcompete the Spanish giants. They didn't have a silver mountain, but they had a stock exchange, and in the New World, a share of a company was more valuable than a mountain of metal. The audit of the Hapsburgs is now closed. They had the gold, but the bankers had the ledger. They had the land, but the merchants had the markets. They were the bridge between the medieval and the modern, a giant that died to feed the growth of its successors. The hidden history of Spain is a warning to every era. Wealth that is extracted is wealth that is lost. Wealth that is created is wealth that lasts. The gold of the Incas is gone, but the financial hardware the Dutch built to handle it still runs the world today. In the age of discovery, fortunes were not just found, they were forged. Imagine a Spanish gold coin, a piece of 8, gleaming as it sinks into the dark, silent abyss. This was the currency of empires, the spoils of conquest, tangible, heavy, real. But what if I told you the greatest treasure wasn't the gold itself, but an idea? An idea so powerful it would reshape the world. As that coin settles on the ocean floor, it transforms. The cold metal gives way to paper, ink, and a wax seal. This is a share certificate, the birth of the modern corporation. This single piece of paper represented a revolutionary concept. You could own a piece of an adventure, a fraction of a voyage to the far side of the world, without ever leaving your home. This innovation funded colossal ships, like the Dutch East Indiaman, vessels that connected continents and created the first global economy. It was a pivot point in human history, where wealth became abstract and ambition limitless. In our next episode, we witness the birth of the VOC, the world's first multinational corporation. We see how the Dutch pivot upgraded the global economy from sovereign debt to public equity. The money trail is moving to Amsterdam, where the golden loop will be transformed into the first stock market. The era of the shareholder has arrived, and the world will never be the same. I'm Edward Turfall, and this is The Hidden History. Subscribe to follow the money into the heart of the first global market. Next time, the Dutch pivot. The receipts are waiting.